This story shocked all the inhabitants of the city. None of them could not even imagine the true causes of this crime, and most importantly, who will be guilty. The results of the investigation and the circle of the guilty will shock you. Stay with us until the end to learn the details of this terrible case. Rumors of the case instantly spread throughout the town. Doubts plagued the people of Gwinnett. How could such a thing have happened? Who could have done such evil to a defenseless girl? With each day of investigation, the circle of suspects was narrowing more and more. Under the watchful eye of the detectives, the facades of prosperity were splintering, exposing rotten secrets and ulterior motives. Shocking facts surfaced, turning upside down the perceptions of Emmony's loved ones. Each of them, as it turned out, had their own skeletons in the closet. The father, who appeared to be a gutless jack-of-all-trades, hid the darker side of his personality. The stepmother, behind a mask of coldness and indifference, concealed a deep-seated hatred. Relatives, friends, neighbors, no one was sinless. Each of them could have been involved in this terrible tragedy. The investigation was at an impasse. It seemed that the true culprit would forever remain in the shadows. But suddenly, an unexpected piece of evidence, like a jigsaw puzzle, fell into place. The mosaic of the crime began to take shape, painting a chilling picture. Who was Emmony's cold-blooded killer? The answer to that question shocks everyone. The results of the investigation turn upside down all ideas about justice and morality. Do not miss the denouement of this shocking story. Stay tuned to Radio Gaga for more updates.
The story of Emmony. In the quiet suburb of Gwinnett, Georgia, there was the tantalizing smell of freshly baked cookies. Tiffany Moss, satisfied with her culinary prowess, pulled a ruddy batch out of the oven, leaving them to cool on the table. She'd been craving chocolate all day, so she talked her husband Emmon into buying some cookie dough on the way home from work. The happy family of four gathered around the cozy table, savoring the taste and aroma. But in the next room, behind a closed door, a very different story was unfolding. 10-year-old Emmony, Tiffany's stepdaughter, lay on the bed, haggard and emaciated. Her body, gaunt to a skeleton, had not been fed in weeks. While her family gorged themselves on sweet treats, Emmony, as if invisible, was tormented by hunger. She was an outcast in her own home, a stranger in this perfect family. Tiffany and Emmons met when the man already had a daughter from a previous marriage. Emmony's mother, struggling with addiction, tried several times to regain custody of her daughter, but was unsuccessful. Emmony stayed with her father. Tiffany, having become a stepmother, spent more and more time at home with the children while Emmons worked 2 jobs. Emmony, once a sweet and affectionate girl with a beaming smile, was slowly fading away. But Tiffany didn't care. She lacked time and attention to another's daughter, who was not her own by blood. Thus, in the atmosphere of contentment and comfort, behind the closed door of the adjoining room, tragedy unfolded. Emmony was starving to death, and no one wanted to help her. Her story is one of indifference, cruelty, and hopelessness, hidden under the mask of a perfect family. Tiffany wrote to Emmons at work, complaining that his daughter was constantly misbehaving all the time. It may have started out as Tiffany ignoring and neglecting Emmons in order to better treat her own children, but it all escalated into something much more serious. In 2010, when Emmony was 6 years old, her teachers reported social services about some concerns, and Tiffany was charged, eventually pleading guilty to hitting Emmon with a belt. Tiffany insisted it was only 2 or 3 times, even though it looked like prolonged abuse. Tiffany was sentenced to 5 years probation. She lost her job and blamed Emmon, thereby making her hate her even more. Tiffany pulled her out of school and kept her home, and Emmony's abuse began to escalate. 2 years later, Emmony tried to run away at least twice and had to sleep in the bushes to avoid going home. When she was found, she said she didn't want to go home and claimed that her stepmother had tied her up with belts and put her in a cold shower. Tiffany denied all of this, and there was no evidence to make any accusations. Emmony was accused of making up the story and brought home. But Emmony wasn't lying, and it was worse than anyone could have imagined. Emmony was kept in her bedroom and deprived of food and water. On at least 2 occasions, Tiffany sent Emmony pictures of meals she had prepared for her husband and her children, who remained happy and healthy. All the while, Emmony was withering. On November 2, 2013, Tiffany's husband Emmony called 911 to report that his 10-year-old daughter was dead. When the police arrived at the apartment, they were horrified to find a galvanized steel garbage can outside with the partially burned body of a girl named Emmony. What horror had happened in the Mosses' home? Emmons was arrested. Tiffany ran to her mom, but she too was tracked down and arrested. At first, Emmons said his daughter died from ingesting chemicals, and instead of reporting her death, they tried to cover up the accident, but his story made no sense. No one believed him. At the time of her death, Emmony weighed only 32 pounds. This is the average weight of an infant. She was severely malnourished. Further on investigation, Emmons' story changed. He said that his wife called him on October 28th and informed him that Emmony was dead. Their neglect meant that she had literally starved to death in her bed. Emmon claimed he wanted to call 911, but went along with his wife's plan to cover up the death and claimed Emmony had run away. They hid Emmony's body in their computer room and continued their normal lives. Tiffany was still on probation for harming Emmony and knew she risked losing her 2 biological children if it became known that Emmons was dead. Emmon told investigators that Tiffany suggested he cremate her remains. Emmon went out and bought a steel can, garbage bags, charcoal, and a lighter fluid. On November 1st, they took Emmony's body to a rural area and even took their other 2 children. They bent Emmony's body, which had become stiff from corpulent petrification, breaking her bones, to stuff it into the barrel. They splashed the incendiary liquid into the can and set the girl's body on fire. Emmons said they watched the flames for 5 minutes before they realized the fire would not burn her remains. So they took Emmony's body home until the next day. Guilt got the better of him, and he notified the authorities. Tiffany and Emmons were charged with murder. When details of what happened to Emmons reached the press, the public was outraged to the core. Many questions were asked about how this was allowed to happen, how no one helped Emmons. Emmon agreed to testify against his wife, and in 2015, he pleaded guilty to murder and was sentenced to life in prison. When Tiffany was tried, she waived an attorney and took the stand in her own defense, but did not testify or call witnesses. She said she believed God would get her through it. It was a harrowing trial in which the jury were subjected to traumatic images and details. The prosecution said Tiffany starved her stepdaughter to death. The prosecution said she was angry at the child for being fired and irritated that she had to take care of a child she didn't want. As a result, the 10-year-old child starved to death, while her own children remained healthy and happy. Emmon, who was still married to Tiffany, testified against his wife, Tiffany. He said his wife and daughter had a love-hate relationship and could not get along. He acknowledged that after the abuse case, the situation had gotten worse. Tiffany was angry at young Emmony for getting her in trouble. Emmons testified that a few days before his daughter's death, she had a seizure, probably from starvation. Tiffany said they couldn't take her to a doctor because she was too thin, so they put her in bed, where she died. When Emmon was asked why he didn't call 911, he said, "I was trying to solve a problem that couldn't be solved." Emmon said Tiffany wanted to bury the body, but he refused. They tried to cremate Emmony, and finally he called to the authorities, saying he couldn't live with the guilt. But his words were hollow as the gruesome details of the horror, the gruesome details of Emmon's gruesome demise of Emmony. Jurors closed their mouths as Emmons wrote how he had breaking his daughter's bones to stuff her body in a steel container. Medical examiners described how Emmons withered without food and water, lying in her own feces because she was too weak. She was too weak to move. Jurors were shown gruesome autopsy photos and told how Tiffany took care of her biological children, but she didn't do the same for Emmons. She was a nobody, the prosecution said, describing how Tiffany humiliated Emmony. She was a nuisance, she was ugly, she was a pain, she was disposable, she was garbage. Jurors wept during closing arguments after hearing how Emmony Moss lived with the evil of the world. Tiffany, 36, was found guilty of murder, child abuse, and concealing a murder, after which the court sentenced her to death to the death penalty. She became the only woman on death row in the state of Georgia, but she has not reacted and has refused to comment. If she is put to death by lethal injection, she will become only the third woman to be executed in state history. But her scheduled execution date was canceled out of automatic appeals. At this time, nothing is known about the fate of the brutal killers, is unknown. I recommend to watch other interesting and not equally shocking stories on the channel. Leave your comments.